Malcolm Gladwell is the best-selling author of The Tipping Point, Blink, and now Outliers, a #1 New York Times bestseller, all of which have sold millions of copies throughout the world. In The Tipping Point, which was UPenn's 2004 freshman reading project selection, Malcolm discussed the potentially massive implications of small-scale social events. His second book, Blink, dealt with why we should trust our first impressions. His latest work, Outliers, explains why some people succeed and go on to live remarkable and incredibly impactful lives. In other words, how people like Malcolm become people like Malcolm. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in warmly welcoming Malcolm Gladwell.
Malcolm, thank you very much for joining us again this evening. We really appreciate it. Firstly, please briefly describe what is profoundly wrong with the way we make sense of success.
Well, I was motivated to write the book by in response to the way in which we personalize success, personalize and individualize. This idea that I'm interested in the extent to which an individual is personally responsible for his or her achievements. And although that seems like a kind of, I mean, it's obvious that they are, in certain key ways they're not. And the question is, what is the balance between the ways in which people are individually responsible and the ways in which they're not? And I would like to argue that the ways in which they are not occupy a significantly larger portion of their achievement than we generally believe.
You state that we make rules that frustrate achievement, we prematurely write off people as failures, we overlook just how large a role we all play, and by we, I mean society, in determining who makes it and who doesn't. Please elaborate, and what sorts of recommendations do you have for schools so opportunity is a bit more democratized?
Yeah. Well, the metaphor that I tell in the book is that I use to talk about this is this stuff about sports, about football and hockey. That if you look at elite hockey players, you discover, also soccer players, you discover that a very, very large, a disproportionately large percentage of them were born in January, February, and March, right? And the reason for this is that the eligibility dates for age class hockey and soccer our eligibility cutoff is January 1st. So when we go and we look for, at the age of 9 and 10 in hockey-mad places like Canada, you go and you look at a whole group of kids and you pick the best ones. So you can put them on an all-star team and give them specialized coaching and create an elite, right? Well, when you look at a group of 9-year-olds and you pick the best hockey players, you're not picking the best ones, you're picking the oldest ones, right? Because at that age, difference between being born in January and December is enormous. So what we do is we collect all the oldest ones, think we're collecting the best ones, give them access to specialized coaching, extra games, all kinds of special opportunities until 7 and 8 and 9 years later they actually are the best. Right? So we have created an elite, not because that elite had any kind of special, unique talent to begin with, but simply because we had an arbitrary rule which gave them privileged access to a set of opportunities that made them who they are. That, to me, is a beautiful metaphor for the way a lot of elite systems work. They are, the phrase that, the lovely phrase that Robert Merton, the famous sociologist, uses to describe this is a Matthew effect. From the verse in the New Testament that says, to him that has much more will be given, right? We create these systems where we identify a group of people who have a narrow initial advantage, and then we shower them with all kinds of additional advantages, which causes that small difference to grow. The American economic system is a beautiful example of a Matthew effect, right? The wealthier you get, the more economic advantages we give you. Right? If you're wealthy enough to be able to afford a house, we let you write off your mortgage, right? We don't let you write off your rent if you're renting. Right? That's a Matthew effect. So the minute you're wealthy enough to own a house, the government steps in and bails you out to the tune of thousands of dollars. And then the minute you're wealthy enough to have investments, we give you a disproportionately lower tax rate on the investment. Right? I mean, these are built into all kinds of different systems. And so when the successful congratulate themselves at some later date for the extraordinary things they've done on their own behalf, they generally forget to point out the extent to which they had been privileged by these kinds of systems. My favorite little factoid in all this was that it used to be the case that the international cutoff date, eligibility date for age class football, soccer around the world was August 1st. And back then, if you looked at the composition of elite soccer teams around the world, they were overwhelmingly filled with people born in August, September, and October. And then about 10 years ago or so, they changed it to January 1st. And within a few years, soccer teams were overwhelmingly filled with people born in January, February, and March. The whole structure of international soccer is an artifact of where we choose to put the birth date, right? So if I was head of the International Soccer Federation and I had a child born on December 1st who I dearly wanted to become a successful soccer player, I would stack the deck in favor of my child by moving the eligibility date to December 1st, right? I mean, let's just be honest and frank about the extent to which these kinds of utterly arbitrary rules structure advantage and create lasting differences in the ability of certain people to achieve. Very long answer to your question.
No, it's an excellent answer. When more people talk about selection, streaming, and differentiated experience, and please describe how someone's date of birth might play into them being at the top instead of soccer and football, the top of their academic class.
Yeah, so the same thing, if you think about what I've just been talking about with sports, we do exactly the same thing when it comes to kids in school, right? We go in, so the reason we have this weird situation in sports is that we start at a very early age, identify a so-called gifted population, and give that gifted population access to unique and special opportunities that speed up their development. We do the same thing with so-called gifted kids, right? We identify a group of children who we believe to be intellectually superior at the age of 9 and 10, yank them out of the normal school system, and give them a privileged set of opportunities, better teachers, smaller classrooms, and lo and behold, they turn out 5 and 6 years down the road to be better students. Right? Now, is it because we were successful and accurate in identifying a uniquely skilled population in the beginning, or is it because we created that superiority by virtue of giving them access to privileged opportunities? Right? And also, if you look at you'll see the same age biases in gifted programs. If you have a school system that has an eligibility cutoff date of September 1st, your gifted program will be full of kids born in September, October, and November. Why? Because just like physical maturity, intellectual maturity at that age is very strongly a function of how old you are, right? Now, why this has not occurred to people running gifted programs, I don't know. But you can see we've got beautiful economic data that shows that kids who are in the youngest cohort in their age class in schools are something like 10% less likely to go to college, 10, 15 years down the road. In other words, these kinds of biases that we build into the system very early on continue to reflect and diminish achievement a decade later. Right? We're not playing games here. We're actually talking about something that has a very real effect on achievement.
Sounds like President-elect Obama should have chosen you as Secretary of Education.
Well, there are many much more. No, I got one idea. I mean, this is, I think the American educational system is in need of many more ideas than that one.
Please describe your 10,000-hour rule and how it might apply to some of the most successful Hollywood agents.
Hollywood agents. Well, the 10,000-hour rule is just this observation that's been made by psychologists that almost without exception, it appears to be impossible to achieve a level of excellence in any cognitively complex task without first putting in 10,000 hours of practice. So you can look at any number of different fields and look at the best people in that field and ask yourself, how long did they have to immerse themselves in that field before they became good, right? So when we look at chess players, grandmasters, there's only been one grandmaster in history who achieved the level of grandmaster without playing 10 years of chess. 10,000 hours in 10 years are roughly the same. It's like 4 hours a day for 10 years gets you 10,000 hours. The only person in history to do it in under 10 years is Bobby Fischer, and he did it in 9 years. Right? You can't find, almost impossible to find a classical composer who composed a truly great work without first composing for 10 years. Right? So even Mozart, who we think of as the poster child for precocity, he doesn't do his first really great work until he's 22 or 23. I mean, really transcendent stuff. And at which point he's been composing for 12 or 13 years. He is actually technically a late bloomer, believe it or not. And only, it's so interesting because, of course, the story we tell ourselves, Mozart is always presented as case study number one in this notion that genius springs, perfectly and beautifully from out of the mouths of babes. Nonsense. He's composing things when he's 10 years old, but they're terrible. He doesn't. It takes him, like anyone else, a long time to be good. And what's interesting about that notion is that it suggests, I think, that we are far too impatient in the development of talent. Our expectations, we like to judge people, and because we like to categorize them and put them in different groups and decide who we're going to back and who we're going to give up on. But I feel like that process, once you understand the 10,000 hour rule, I think that you come to the conclusion that we do that kind of categorization much too quickly. Basically it says if you want to know whether someone's any good, you have to give them a chance to practice for 10 years first, right? There isn't a, take that little nugget into corporate America and see how far you'll get. And it also says that those who are, it is so difficult to put 10,000 hours of practice in that it says that those who get good, who have the opportunity to be good, are usually those who have had some special opportunity to practice, right? So you can't, if you want to be a great piano player, you can't have a part-time job after school in high school. You can't come from a family that requires you to work, because there's no way, we know that you cannot be a great pianist unless you put in 10,000 hours, and you absolutely cannot. There are not enough hours in the day to get your 10,000 hours in before the age of 22 or 23 if you have a part-time job. Right? It's a very simple illustration of a fact that says you will never get, except in the most extraordinary of circumstances, a great pianist or a great chess player or a great anything of this type from a family that's not wealthy enough to support children without themselves going out to work. Right? Now, a beautiful little illustration of how class matters and how our idealized notion about how talent always rises to the top in our society is nonsense. Right? There's a massive constraint on it, which is this fact that you need 10,000 hours and only a small number of people can possibly be in a position to get that in.
Why is the IQ test still used, since, as you write, it does not have a correlation to someone's success, only measures what Lewis Terman thought determines intelligence, and classifies selected, streamed, and differentiated students and the non-ones the same when they take the test?
Well, it's not that IQ tests are useless. They're very, very useful. And they do correlate with success, but they correlate success in a very specific way. There is this, I don't actually use this phrase in the book, but there's this lovely concept in statistics called restriction of range, which says that, those of you who study statistics all know what I'm talking about, which says that as you get to the top of any distribution, your ability to meaningfully measure differences between data points becomes limited. Another way of saying this is that the things that, the qualifications that one uses to join a group are different from the qualifications that are different from the Here I am talking about IQ, and we haven't even turned on the qualifications that get you into a group are different from the kinds of things that make you good at that particular discipline, right? So entrance criteria are different from excellence criteria. So here's an example. A simple example is you have to be tall to play basketball, right? That's an entrance criteria. You cannot be 5 feet and want to play in the NBA, right? But once you are tall, someone's height cannot reliably be used to predict their excellence at the task of being an NBA basketball player, right? I recently did a story about teachers, about what makes a teacher good. And teachers are a great example of this. You need to be relatively smart to be a teacher. But once you're smart enough, your IQ is no longer a good predictor of your ability to be a good teacher, right? It predicts entrance. It does not predict excellence. Well, IQ in general works this way. So you need to be smart enough to go to Harvard or Yale or Cambridge or Penn. But once you are smart enough to get in, your IQ is meaningless as a predictor of your performance while you're there. So this is, in fact, has led a number of very, very smart people to suggest that the ways in which Ivy League schools, for example, and this is a favorite hobby horse of mine because I didn't go to an Ivy League school and many of you did, so it's a wonderful opportunity for me to sort of get on my high horse. And I believe the last time I was here, I lectured at length on this, but I can't resist, so I'll return to it. The way in which schools like that, elite schools, run their admissions programs is nonsensical, right? They take a whole group of people who have almost basically identical entrance criteria, and they presume to be able to distinguish among them on the basis of those entrance criteria, right? You can't do it. You can't. All you can do, all you ought to be able to do if you're running an elite school is you say, here's a series of cutoff criteria. You've got to have at least X on your SAT. You must have at least X on your high school grades. You must have at least 2 really warm recommendations from interesting people. And after that, we're going to throw you into a hat, and we're going to take the names out, and the lucky ones get in, and the ones who lose the lottery don't. That is the only intellectually justifiable way to run an entrance into an elite institution. And anyone else who tells you otherwise is blowing smoke, right? It's nonsense. This is anyway, I could go on and on. But so it says that it's not to say that IQ is useless. It is only to say that IQ is of limited use in the prediction of excellence. And that was sort of one of the points I wanted to get at, because we are, of course, even though we routinely claim not to be, we are infatuated with IQ simply because we love the idea that this number is meaningful. In fact, it's of a limited meaning.
Furthering that point a little more, the one story from the book that I will ask you about this evening is a different path that Chris Langan and Robert Oppenheimer took. Please very briefly describe who Chris Langan is, what he is doing, and why his path is so different from Oppenheimer, who attempted to murder his professor but became famous.
Yeah. Well, you've given away my punchline. But at this very point, I tell the story in the book about this guy named Chris Langan, who is believed to be the person with the highest IQ in maybe the world, certainly America. And his IQ is, it's impossible to tell. When you get into the upper ranges of the IQ test, of course, the IQ test ceases to become useful. So you have to develop, for people who score really high, you have to develop like super IQ tests. And then out of them, you develop an even more extravagant IQ test. It's like it's like Russian dolls. And then in the end, you have this kind of super IQ test. Anyway, this guy got like 19 out of 20 on the super IQ test. So he's for much of his life, he's been a bouncer in a bar. So the question is, how is it that the guy with the highest IQ that we've ever seen, he's got 40 points on Einstein, for goodness sake, right? How is it he's a bouncer in a bar? So I was trying to, the reason is, of course, that once you're past a certain point of smartness, probably an IQ of 120, all those extra IQ points don't matter. It's the same thing we've been talking about. It's an entrance criteria, not an excellence criteria. And so I thought it would be really fun to compare him. And I tell the story of his life, and his life is really interesting because he gets a scholarship to college, and he drops out for the most kind of bizarre and totally hard to understand reasons. His scholarship gets screwed up, and he can't convince Reed College, where he's going, to let him stay, and so he drops out, and he never actually gets his BA. And this man, who by rights should have gotten like 4 PhDs and published 1,000 scientific papers, ends up as a bouncer in a bar in Long Island. And so I decided to contrast this to the story of Robert Oppenheimer, who is a similar kind of child, one of these 1 in a billion kids with a super, super high IQ, and everyone thought he was a genius. But he doesn't grow up as Chris Langan did in this kind of very poor, impoverished background. He grows up on Central Park West, and he goes to ethical culture, and he goes to Harvard, and then he goes to Cambridge. And when he also, when he's in college, encounters a difficulty. Only his difficulty is not that they screw up the paperwork on his scholarship. His difficulty is that he tries to murder his tutor at Cambridge. And what happens to Oppenheimer when he tries to murder his tutor at Cambridge? He talks his way out of it. They give him probation, and the punishment is he has to go down to London and see a Harley Street psychiatrist once a week, right? So here's this wonderful, little comparison. The super brilliant kid who gets drummed out of Reed College because his paperwork gets screwed up, and the super brilliant kid who tries to murder his tutor. By the way, not just any tutor. This guy Blackburn or Black something, who goes on to win a Nobel Prize later. So he tries to murder a future Nobel Prize winner. And what happens to him? He goes on to hold the single most important government job of the 20th century, right? The Manhattan Project. So that's all about, that has, at this point, we are so far beyond IQ, and we're talking about other things. We're talking about your ability to negotiate your social surroundings and to get your way in the world. And so that whole chapter is all about the importance of class, because the argument there is that Oppenheimer was taught how to get his way and negotiate his way out of trouble, because that's what you learn when you grow up in an educated, wealthy family on Central Park West. That is the gift that upper middle class parents give to their kids. And that is the thing that is notably lacking from the upbringing of children who grow up on the other side of the tracks. And that's another one of these impediments that we don't want to talk about, and I think that we have to acknowledge if we're going to do something about or help those on the other side of the tracks to achieve.
What is the difference, you briefly described it, but what is the difference between practical and analytical intelligence, and why has practical intelligence served Steve Jobs so much better than the analytical intelligence of thousands of people at competitive corporations?
Well, practical intelligence, so here we're getting into sort of this whole, there's recently been a great deal of interest in this notion, with emotional intelligence as a kind of subset of this, and we have become aware that when we look at people who are very, very successful in their careers, they do not fit the profile of those who are very, very successful at school, right? So we're becoming increasingly and painfully aware that performance at academic tasks is not the most useful of predictors of performance in the real world. Now, we kind of knew that all along, right? But we go through these periods of conveniently forgetting that fact. Jobs, I don't know whether Jobs, Jobs is I don't actually talk about Jobs, I haven't in my book, nor have I thought about him to any great extent. He's clearly a wonderful example of something. What he is a wonderful example of, though, I'm not sure. I do have a little moment in the book where I talk about how so many people in Silicon Valley, how it's so weird that so many people in Silicon Valley were all born in 1955 or thereabouts, which is a sort of generational effect, that to have come of age in the mid-'80s, to be 21 in 1987 or 6, 1976, is a wonderful thing, because 1976 is the year the personal computer kind of comes of age, and you want to be 21, right? And so Gates and Jobs and Bill Joy and all these characters, the guys at Sun, Microsystems, they're all born in 55. Eric Schmidt at Google. And that's not a coincidence. So that's a kind of an additional advantage that we don't sort of think about. So he has that going from him. And he also has, Jobs is born in Mountain View. Or not born, he's raised in Mountain View. My favorite story about Jobs is, as a kid, he hangs out at all these flea markets in Mountain View. Mountain View is, of course, the epicenter of Silicon Valley, right? And a flea market in Mountain View in the 70s and the late 60s, is a place is not where they sell, you know, bad oil paintings and clothes from the 40s. It's a place where they sell computer parts. So he's steeped in this world. He's getting his 10,000 hours in from this high, and he's building little sets. And at one point, my favorite story about him is oh, it works. He's trying to build some little gizmo in his basement, and he can't find a part, and so he calls on the phone the guy down the street, who he's, you know, one of his neighbors, and that guy down the street is Bill Hewlett of Hewlett and Packard, right? So you know, this guy doesn't come from anywhere, right? I mean, it's another example of how excellence is grounded in specific environments. And Bill Gates, if Bill Gates grows up in if Steve Jobs grows up in the middle of Montana, he's not the head of Apple, right? You have to have that. He's from Mountain View, and that matters. In this very, very, in fact, I saw a documentary on Steve Jobs, and the first thing out of his mouth, which is interestingly was the first thing out of Bill Gates' mouth when I interviewed him for my book, the first thing out of his mouth is, "I am the luckiest guy in the world." And that's what he means, that he was lucky because here's a computer pioneer who's born in the town that invented the computer practically, not really, but that invented that was the epicenter of computing in the 1960s and 70s, and where Bill Hewlett and Packard are down the street, right? And that's of incalculable importance in understanding, why he is who he is.
What was your unique opportunity that you attribute as your tipping point? Was it your 10,000 hours at the Washington Post and New Yorker, and your unique and wonderful parents, Graham and Joyce?
What was my... Well, I did get... I mean, I have the 10,000 hour thing really resonates with me because I spent exactly 10 years at the Washington Post, and when I started, I was not a very good writer and not a very good reporter, and when I left, I had learned those two skills. And there is no more, I mean, when people talk about 10,000 hours, they use this wonderful term called deliberate practice, which says that it is not enough merely to do something for 10 years in order to be good. It must take the form of deliberate practice. In other words, it must be a kind of intensive, feedback-rich, mentor-filled, highly kind of intensive environment, right? It's playing the piano with your, 70-year-old piano teacher from Vienna standing over your shoulder, rapping you on the knuckles when you make a mistake. It's learning surgery at the hands of a master surgeon who, when you make a mistake, sits down after the surgery is over and makes you practice that thing 5 or 6 or 7 times until you get it right. That's what we mean by deliberate practice. So it wasn't that I was sitting in my room writing on my laptop. I had this extraordinary opportunity to be at an institution where was surrounded by incredibly expert role models, where, for goodness sake, Bob Woodward's desk was 10 yards from my own in the newsroom of the Washington Post, and where my editors were people who had been working in newspapers for 30 years, and if you did something wrong or dumb or ill-formed, they rapped you on the knuckles, and you couldn't go home until you got it right. And that went on for 10 years. And that is how you learn to be good at something. And that was I did not create that opportunity for myself. It was given to me for the most, by the way, random of reasons. It's not worth going into now, but it remains slightly mysterious to me how I ever got that job. But having got it, I was like Steve Jobs in Mountain View. I was in an environment that allowed my particular, that was thinking a lot about. It was thinking about that in part kind of led me to want to write this account of success, because I'm so keenly aware of how it took that form in my own life.
I think one of the most interesting things you raise in your book, Blank, is when you talk about when people describe the ideal mate, they only can describe the traits of which they're consciously aware but they could easily meet someone who meets all those traits, but the chemistry is just not right because there's so many things of which they're not consciously aware, which are unconscious. Could you talk a little bit more about how that mechanism works in some different ways it tends to play into everyday life?
Wow, you take me back to a book I haven't thought about in 6 years. Well, actually it ties in very beautifully to what I've been talking about just now. So if you think about, so here's the great puzzle. When we meet somebody for the first time, this is actually the part in which Blink and Outliers connect. You meet someone for the first time, there are certain things that you are really, really good at instantly figuring out about that person, and certain things that you're really bad at figuring out about that person. Right? If any of us meet someone to whom, and we're asked the question, are you attracted to that person, we can answer incredibly accurately, incredibly quickly. Right? In fact, we can do it in less than a second. Why are we so good at that? Because we've had 10,000 hours of practice. What do you spend your teenage years doing? Right? All day long, over and over again, in the most deliberate way imaginable, the most intensive, feedback-rich, like everything I was talking about before, endlessly going through your mind this little loop about, am I attracted to them? Am I attracted to that person? Attracted to that person? What am I attracted to? And by the time you're like, 17, 18, you're really, really good at that, and you will remain good at that for the rest of your life. Same thing with extroversion. What do you learn from the first moment as a child when you relate to other kids? What's the question you ask? Do I want to play with that person? Does that person make me laugh, right? Those are questions that we ask from this point all the way on. Every time we go to a group, we gravitate towards those people who can promise us that experience. Right? So of course we're good at that. Now what are we not good at? Well, we're not good at knowing whether someone is conscientious. We're not good at knowing whether someone is honest, intelligent, thoughtful, all those kinds of other much more complex tasks. Why? Because we don't have 10,000 hours of practice for those kinds of things. With making those kinds of much more complex judgments. They're really hard to make. We don't have the kind of feedback necessary. You can't have deliberate practice on conscientiousness because in order to judge someone's conscientiousness, you've got to be able to see them in very specific circumstances over and over and over again. We don't have that, with the vast majority of people we meet, we never have that ability, that opportunity to practice. Right? So that's why, that is why it explains both our extraordinary strengths and our extraordinary weaknesses when it comes to the judgments we make about both mates and also, about, job hires or, any kind of personal transaction is both enabled and limited by those facts about what we've been able to practice.
Justin?
I hope you might share some thoughts on Obama and how he fits into your theory of success.
Yeah. I was going to answer this. It's always a hard one to. There's a couple of interesting things. In the second half of the book, we didn't talk about this here, but in the second half of the book, I talk a lot about culture and about what are the ways in which our cultural heritages influence the way we behave and influence our ability to achieve. And so I have 2 chapters, one which talks about how your cultural heritage affects your ability to do math. And another is about how your cultural heritage affects your ability to fly an airplane safely. And in both those cases, I believe and argue that almost nothing is more relevant to the discussion of what it takes to be good at math and what it takes to be a good pilot as the cultural background of the math student or the pilot. And so it's an exploration of just about how extraordinarily influential culture is. And then I have a chapter on my parents, on my mother's family. My mother is a brown-skinned Jamaican, and that chapter is all about what does it mean to be a brown-skinned Jamaican, and it turns out there are a whole series of advantages rooted deeply in the peculiar history of Jamaica that accrue to people who are of mixed race background in Jamaica. Among them, the fact that the British colonial presence in Jamaica, if you were the offspring of a slave and a landowner, as my great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather was, you were freed. You weren't pushed back into slavery as you were in America. In Jamaica and in the West Indies, you were freed because the British wanted to, they were so outnumbered, they wanted to kind of gather as many hopefully friendly faces around them as possible. So they would actually educate mixed-race offspring. And the argument there is that this kind of pattern of advantage that goes back 300 years matters today. It helps to explain why my mother has been as successful as she has, and it helps to explain why her mother was as successful, and on and on. Well, I'm very tempted to make that kind of argument with Obama. I don't know enough about, I'm not in a position to make it in a kind of sustained way, but it is more than significant that he is the product of, that his father is African, Kenyan, and not African American. And I don't mean that in any way as a way of denigrating African Americans and and holding up Africans. I'm simply saying, look, these are two profoundly different cultural heritages, and once we are honest and open and acknowledge that our cultural heritages matter, we have to. I think we have to say, look, surely it is significant that this man comes from this particular kind of background and was not, as a result, saddled with so many of the particular and, I think, exquisitely meaningful burdens that come with being an African American. Along the same lines, I've always thought it was, well, no, I'll stop at that. But it's a difficult thing to discuss in a kind of open way. But I think it's worthy of consideration.
Yes.
I haven't read Outliers yet, although I intend to. So when you were talking today about IQ versus luck, can you make luck?
Well, society can make luck. So the question was, can you make luck? Individuals can't make luck, but society can. So when to go back to that example of hockey, and we choose the January 1st cutoff date, and so we then bestow luck upon kids born in January, February, March, right? We could, if we wanted to, create a system that bestowed a lucky break on anyone who wanted to play hockey. We could have 3 parallel hockey leagues, one for kids born in the first 4 months of the year, one for kids born in 4 through 8, and one for kids born in 9 through 12, right? That would be a way in which we could even out the distribution of opportunity. We choose not to do that for reasons that I don't understand. We could simply do the same thing in, right now in the school system, kids who are the relatively oldest in their elementary school class are given luck. Right? We bestow a lucky break on them. If we wanted to, we could have 3 parallel streams in elementary schools divided up by month of birth, right? A real simple way to even out luck. So that's something that as a society we can address very easily. But if you're the kid who's born in December in the January 1st cutoff date grade 1 classroom, you can't, there's nothing you can do, right? It reminds us that our overemphasis on individual responsibility for achievement is a way of evading responsibility for our collective efforts on behalf of success.
David?
Thanks, Malcolm, thanks for being here. How do you square your theory of 10,000 hours and that experience matters enormously in determining ultimate success and ultimately mastering something with the notion held by many employers that, look, I don't care about experience, what I hire for is temperament, what I hire for is personality, not experience. And if I put it as a personal example, in hiring an executive assistant, I care less about someone who's been an executive assistant for 10 years, 10,000 hours, and more that they worked in a bar, know how to handle people, and can handle the telephone calls that are coming in. Mm-hmm. How do you square those things?
Well, remember, with 10,000 hours, we're talking about cognitively complex tasks. So it's most applicable when we're talking about being a surgeon, being a computer programmer, being a chess grandmaster, as we move kind of further down the kind of the cognitive complexity ladder, it's less of an issue. And so I think you're absolutely right. When you hire an executive assistant, you do hire for temperament. And because you believe that the things, the cognitively complex tasks they need to master are not so complex that they will require 10,000 hours, unless you're running, a really extraordinary operation over there. I would imagine that Bernie Madoff's executive assistant might well have had to have 10,000 hours. But your criteria would shift dramatically if you were hiring at the upper end. If you were hiring a chief surgeon at Mount Sinai, we would ask a very different set of, right? You don't hire on temperament there. In fact, you probably would do well to ignore temperament entirely. My experience with surgeons at Mount Sinai is that they do, in fact, ignore temperament entirely.
On the subject of surgeons and medical training, there's recently been a push to change the way work hours are. And I was wondering if you think that there is a difference to the quality of the 4th hour that you spend practicing every day as opposed to the 36th hour the second day. And also, if you finish your neurosurgery training at 45 instead of like 39 or whatever it would be, is that better or worse?
Yeah. Well, this is actually, you're absolutely right to bring it up. This is a beautiful illustration of this very debate we're talking about. So we have this extraordinary robust data on 10,000 hours. And it says that as far as we can tell, there are no shortcuts. So you simply need to do a certain number of repetitions of some difficult task before you can master it. So given that fact that there doesn't seem to be a shortcut, we haven't found one yet, you cannot be an expert surgeon unless you've put in that number of repetitions. So we have this question of, how do we choose to get those, to structure those, that necessary minimum number of repetitions? Do we want to do it where you stay up 36 hours in a row, or is there a way that is a better way to do that? Now, that is a question that is that demands a kind of careful experimental analysis. I don't know whether we know that. I mean, a surgeon, having never stayed up for 36 hours in a row, I have no idea how good my learning ability is in the 36th hour. But certainly, given the fact that you've got to get a certain number of reps in, there's no way around the onerous nature of medical training. But the question is, is there a way to, is there some kind of balance that we can strike between the necessary number of reps and a humane learning environment? Like, that's the issue. There's this interesting thing about class advantages, which is class advantage is a U-shaped curve, right? So it sucks to be at the bottom. It gets better as you come towards the top. But when you're at the very top, it sucks again, right? In fact, this gets, so I always think it's like there's a matrix. There are advantages that are advantages. There are advantages that are disadvantages. There are disadvantages that are advantages. And there are disadvantages that are, I've forgotten the last one. Whatever, you know what I'm saying. So if you are Warren Buffett's kid, that's an advantage, that's a disadvantage, right? Because if you're so rich that you have no reason to ever, like, it's really hard to put in 10,000 hours, for example, if daddy has $20 billion, right? It's a lot easier if daddy has $200,000, right? In fact, daddy probably has to have $200,000 if you're going to get that kind of 10,000 hours in. So you have this, depending on where you are in the curve, you can either be richly advantaged, or it can sort of spin around and start to hurt you again. And there's this lovely strain. This idea is really big in the 19th century. In the Henry Ward Beecher, who was a very famous preacher in 19th century New York and had a very wealthy congregation. After one of the devastating financial crises of, I think, the 1870s, he addresses his congregation of wealthy Wall Streeters, and he says to them how lucky they are that their children will have a chance to escape the enervating effects of wealth. He was delighted. He thought that it was the best thing possible. The children of these potentates should be free of the yoke of economic advantage and should have to kind of, actually work for a living. There's something to that. Because these kids were not being pushed into absolute deprivation, but they were just being pushed back to the fat part of the curve, the point where they were just rich enough to be able to get advantages, but not so rich as to have their own ambition completely enervated. Success by gender. Well, it fits in very beautifully into this theory, right? Because what I'm saying is that when we look at patterns of achievement, we need to pay attention, first of all, to the social and environmental and generational preconditions for that achievement, and not at the individual, right? And not ask, in other words, I want us to stop asking questions about people's innate abilities and ask questions first and foremost about their social advantages, the kinds of things that put them in a position to do something. When it comes to the achievement of women in certain kinds of fields, there is a tendency of the population that wants to rush to the innate argument, right? And there are all kinds of people who will make all kinds of fancy arguments about how, well, the reason women don't excel in math is because their brains don't do this particular thing, and blah, 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 right? To which I say, wait a minute, you're putting the cart before the horse. Long before we even consider that question, we should ask ourselves, are the social preconditions for achievement in math and science equal for men and women, right? And if we can identify a difference in those social preconditions, then that's where we should spend our time and attention. And if after we've equalized those conditions, there continues to be a difference in performance, only then should we ask the question about innate ability. I mean, this goes to this, it's a very kind of beautiful way of explaining this question, and that is this idea that the psychometrician James Flynn has when he talks about capitalization. And capitalization is the word he uses to describe the question of what percentage of people who are capable of doing X end up doing X, right? So suppose, we can define this in any way we want. So suppose we went to Harlem and we said, what is the professional basketball capitalization rate for the black teenagers of Harlem? In other words, what percentage of black teenage Harlem basketball players who have the talent, the ability to play in the NBA, end up playing in the NBA, right? That percentage is the capitalization rate for black kids in Harlem, right? Or you can ask the question, what percentage of kids who have the intellectual ability to be a professional, a doctor or a lawyer, end up being a doctor or a lawyer? And Flynn does this really wonderful work where he shows that the professional capitalization rate differs enormously by ethnic group. So among the ethnic group with the highest capitalization rate for the professions are Chinese Americans, who have a cap rate of 78%, which is astonishing. It says that 78% of all Chinese American immigrants and their children in America who have the brains to be a doctor or a lawyer become a doctor or a lawyer, right? That is an extraordinary achievement. It says that within that community they have managed to exploit their intellectual capital to a degree that almost no other group in human history has ever done, right? It's a powerful and beautiful thing that we should learn from. The same number for white Americans would be, I think, is in the 50s, and the same number for African Americans is probably in the teens, right? And that says, so we're not talking at all about the native levels of ability in all those different groups, right? We're completely uninterested in it. All we're interested in is how good are you at exploiting the talent that you've got. And what we see is there are enormous differences from group to group, right? So another great example of this is Kenyan distance runners. You go to the World Cross Country Championship next March. The first 10 people across the finish line will be Kenyan, right? Or Ethiopian. And some people say, oh, that's because they're innately better distance runners than Westerners. To which I say, nonsense. What that says to me is their capitalization rate for distance running is probably 99%. They have found and exploited the talent of every single young Kenyan or Ethiopian who wants to run. our capitalization rate for distance running in the United States is probably 1%, right? I mean, within this room, there may well be people who have the talent to be a world-class distance runner who have never run a step. So we can't even begin to talk about whether they are innately better than us until we have a capitalization rate that's equal to theirs, until we have social structures that are in place to allow us to see how much talent we have, right? And that is the, so the capitalization rate for female scientists in this country is a fraction of what it is for male scientists. That's the appropriate way to think about that question.
Ladies and gentlemen, there's going to be a reception in the back with drinks for everybody, and Malcolm is going to sign books and interact with people. So please join me in thanking him for brilliant and entertaining speech.